Hello, everyone. Warm and joyful greetings to you today. Welcome to Nurture the Soul. I'm your host, Tracy Howe, team leader and minister for Faith Education, Innovation, and Formation, FaithINFO for short, at the national setting of the United Church of Christ. Nurture the Soul is a weekly webinar series sharing practical, educational, innovative, and formational resources engaging critical topics for our local churches and people of faith. This is produced by Justice and Local Church Ministries of the United Church of Christ. From cultural and community organizing to congregational leadership, from worship and theology to resourcing small and rural churches, from ministry with youth and children to wide-ranging justice issues. We feature guest artists, authors, key leaders from all settings of our church, and move and engage the ways the gospel is alive in this time. This is a space for connection, community, and nurture. Together, we can bring our church, our community, and the world towards the world God imagines for us all. So join us here every Thursday at 3:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time for Nurture the Soul, and look for special offerings from time to time outside of that space as well. We are always producing opportunities to engage, and you can find a full list of upcoming digital programming offerings at ucc.org/events or on any of our social media platforms. Friends, if this conversation moves you today on safety and security in our local churches, we also invite you to help us sustain this ministry through giving to our annual fund. You can text UCC to 41444. Your prayerful and financial support helps programs like this in the essential work of the United Church of Christ. Thank you and thank you. So today we are in our third episode of a three-part series on safety and security in our local churches. We began with a conversation with Reverend Ann Dunlap, faith organizer for Showing Up for Racial Justice. Ann introduced us to a community safety for all toolkit that includes assessment tools and ways to build teams and practices geared towards community safety for all. On the second episode last week, we had local church leaders from Clackamas UCC in Oregon, as well as Katie Adams, our domestic policy advocate in the Washington, D.C. office. And we looked at the ways that General Synod resolutions are related to issues that we're dealing with now in safety and security, and asked, how can we be faithful to what we've already committed to as a denomination? Things that came up in particular were resolutions on racial justice, its relationship to policing and incarceration, resolutions on gun violence, resolutions on keeping children safe from violence, and how those are unfolding in the lives of our local churches around the country. And so today, as we continue this conversation, I'm so glad to have with us two local church leaders who are going to share what their setting is, the issues that they're dealing with regarding safety and security, what has prompted them to come into these conversations, and what that process looks like now. We have with us Richard Race, who's a member of Parkway UCC in St. Louis. He's been a member for over 15 years and has served on the council for 3 years and as a treasurer for 5 years. He's currently the treasurer for the cemetery and a member of the safety team. Richard, can you say hello to everybody?
Well, hello.
We're so glad to have you here and looking forward to you sharing all of the wisdom that you've been building with your local church. I also want to lift up that you've been retired for 7 years from a 40+ career year in software management and security. So now you're doing all this work at the church, but you're also very focused on grandchildren, volunteering, things like that.
Yes, absolutely.
We're so glad to have you. We also have Pastor Jess Peacock, they, them, who's the current pastor of Community Church of Chesterland, outside of Cleveland, Ohio. Can you say hello, Jess?
Hello, thank you for having me.
Yeah, their church made national news recently because they were firebombed by a representative of White Lives Matter in an attempt to prevent several drag events from taking place. So you have been, your job description as pastor at Chesterland has expanded to include now fighting Nazis, apparently. Is that the case?
Yeah, unfortunately, it's not something that I'm all that inexperienced in. My first congregation was in Eastern Washington, which is an deeply racist area, and we were doing racial justice work there. So death threat on my front door, all sorts of community issues there too. So
okay, so this is no problem.
Yeah, I'm just ticking off Nazis wherever.
It's not a surprise, we shall say. It's actually a huge problem for a lot of us. And so we're looking forward. We're so glad you could join us to kind of have this conversation together. And I really am glad that you're both here because you represent our denomination in so many different ways, both of your churches and both of what you're pursuing. And what I would love to start with is just tell us about your churches. Tell us about your communities. Richard, let's start with you. We've heard a little bit about, you've been there for quite a while. So tell us what you love about Parkway and what's your setting? Like, is it very urban? Is it suburban? Is it rural? Like, St. Louis is huge. So just locate your church a little bit.
We're a pretty old congregation. We were actually founded in the mid 1800s by German immigrants coming into the St. Louis area. So the land we're on was donated by farmers and used to be farmland. It is now pretty much middle and upper class white suburbia. And I will lend in probably pretty conservative. And so we are a bit of a controversy in the community. We are an open and affirming congregation and have been for a long time. We fly rainbow flags year round. Out in front, we have a sign that says things that are somewhat provocative, not intentionally, but some of the local folks are wondering who we are. As treasurer, I once opened an envelope and it was a $500 donation from a Muslim physician who drove by our sign every day and said, "Wow, you say nice things about Muslims." And we do also interfaith with a Jewish congregation and the Muslim group too. Very, very open and out in the community about that. Some of the people that go to our congregation are descendants from the original founders. We're very much like so many churches. Our congregation is aging. We do have new families, coming in, but our youth organization is probably down to maybe 20 kids. We started when one of our older folks had a heart attack during the service, and we realized that we didn't have proper equipment to address that. And so we did go out and get an AED machine and learn how to use it. About 5 years ago, we started our safety team and said, we want to address and have procedures for everything, every type of emergency that we can think of, from a medical emergency. So we got CPR training in and offered that free to the congregation. Weather emergencies, flooding, who do you call if there's a backup in the bathroom? And then this course then grows into fire and those sorts of things you have to have anyway as a public place. We are very open to the community. We really endeavor that our facilities are used to the biggest extent we can. Our main building's 50 years old and does need a lot of fairly expensive maintenance now. But we have AA groups almost every morning of the week and most evenings. We have NA groups. I'm working right now with the PFLAG group because their national organization has warned them, take a look at the security of where you're meeting. So I'm partnering with them to work together with our community police.
Yeah. You also have a school, is that correct?
We do have a school. We have a wing that was built as a school. We currently are actually leasing that to a private school. We ran our own school for quite a number of years. And that gives me, as a security guy, scratching my head because we actually have 33 outside doors in our building. That's a lot of doors to protect.
We'll get to that. Sounds like
Yes.
you've done quite a number of
But
assessments.
that's because of the school. The school, that is a service to our community that we have been doing for many decades
Great.
in
Can you tell
various
us
ways.
how many people worship with you on a Sunday morning? Give us a feel for just the size of your congregation.
Size-wise, we have about right around 200 families that participate with us. Of course, during COVID, the building was closed, everything was online. Now our actual attendance is less than it was pre-COVID because so many people have stayed online. Again, we do have an older population, and the online access for them is really a blessing too. So we might have 100 people actually in the sanctuary. We refer to it as a Sunday morning experience because there are probably 8 rooms that'll have activities going on simultaneously between youth groups and Christian education and music groups and the admin people in the office. So the building is very active on a Sunday morning.
Great. Well, thank you so much for sharing that, Richard. We'll jump into some more details soon, but Pastor Jess, what's Chesterland like?
So we are just outside of Cleveland, but we're far enough outside of Cleveland that we are a fairly rural church. We do have people that come from Cleveland, but our locale is smack dab in what is called Geauga County, which is right beside Cuyahoga County, which is Cleveland. In very, very, very conservative area. If you drive through Geauga County, you see all the Trump signs still up, weird signs that have like Jesus wrapped in an American flag, and just atypical of a lot of conservative areas around the country today. We are probably one of the few progressive voices in the county. Not the only, but one of the few, and one of the very few progressive religious voices within the county. This church has been open and affirming for several decades, and have sort of faced microaggressions all along the way. Well, I don't even know how micro they are, like pride flags continuing to get stolen, and there's been a case of a dead animal being put on the front door of the church. So
that's a macro aggression.
yeah, definitely. Yeah. I mean, compared to a firebombing, it's almost micro, but I completely agree. So our church has been in a situation where it's sort of been in the eye of the storm, whether they wanted to be or not. And the church decided to sort of act upon their open and affirming ethos and begin expanding LGBTQ programming. And I've been there a year, and right as I came in last year, the church was in the process of putting together the first ever Pride event in Geauga County. And so I sort of walked right into it. I walked into a hornet's nest upon arriving, because right away we had, I don't remember how many churches they were, maybe like 20 churches sign a letter to try to get our Pride shut down. The hate mail was rolling in right as I arrived, were abominations, were Satanists for doing Pride, all this type of stuff. The theft of our flags continued, but that didn't deter us. We decided to continue with not only Pride, but queer-oriented programming throughout the year. The church itself is not solely focused on LGBTQ issues. That is, right now, it is a major focus, but it's not the only focus. We have a very active social justice ministry where we seek to support other groups, involve ourselves wherever we can within the community. We do free meals for low-income families. Church size, when I arrived here about a year ago, I think we were doing maybe like about 20, 25 people a week. Right now we're doing about 40 to 50 people a week. So we have seen growth, and a lot of that growth has come from our stance, has come from our refusal to allow hate to silence us or shut us down in any way. So we have seen the good and the bad amidst all of this. The good being that there are people out there who have literally verbally said to us in writing as well, you're giving me hope.
Yeah.
Your stance, your refusal to back down is giving me hope. And then, of course, the bad is dealing with um, attacks on our church, whether verbal attacks, physical attacks, what have you. But no one said social justice was easy. No one said this type of work was going to be a smooth ride. And so I think, by and large, throughout our church community, there is an eagerness to continue this kind of work and to refuse to back down in the face of violence and hate.
Yeah, thank you so much. Um, I think that's a really beautiful thing to uplift as we enter into this, really, really intense and urgent conversation. Both of you have stated that your testimony in the world has alerted vulnerable people that perhaps you are a safe place, or a place of resistance to a lot of violence that vulnerable people are coming up against. But then, as you seek to live out the gospel and continue this testimony, what does this mean when our vulnerability, our bodily vulnerability, is increasing? And we have spoken on this series about the horrific fact that gun violence is now the #1 cause of death for young people in this country. That's a shame. It's I don't have any words for it. And what does it mean to keep children safe in your place, in your communities of faith? Just today, or I'm sorry, yesterday, the Department of Homeland Security issued a bulletin warning people of a heightened threat environment. And it includes that the belief that people that they've been following, lone offenders and small groups motivated by a range of ideological beliefs, are going to continue to pose a persistent and lethal threat to people living in this country. And they highlight domestic violent extremists, which in large part are white Christian nationalists, neo-Nazis, and others. But they specifically lift up likely targets of potential violence include U.S. critical infrastructure and faith-based institutions, individuals and events associated with the LGBTQIA+ community, schools, racial and ethnic minorities. So that was posted just yesterday, and it's very sobering. And it's, we're gonna talk about, what does security mean? What does safety mean? What are the systems that we rely on and the resources that we have? And I would like for you to share a little bit more about what has brought you into this conversation before we get into the practical things about what you're doing. Tell us a little bit more about what is pushing you into this. It's more than a conversation, this process of increasing security and safety for your community. So Pastor Jess, you mentioned firebomb, but I'm not, go ahead and just be a little bit more specific about what you've been through in the last number of months, and then we'll turn it over to Richard.
Yeah, so several months ago, we had made a decision to sponsor several drag events in early April. And it started off as 2 events, one that was adult oriented, that was going to be at a partnering restaurant. And then we were going to do a drag story hour at our church the same day. They both received a wonderful response. We ended up actually needing to add another show because tickets sold so fast and there was so much desire, it felt like, in the community for those. And we, the minute we started advertising, we received the stuff that we were expecting first, which was emails, social media, responses, that kind of thing. We're groomers, we're Satanists, we're abominations, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Which we expected. That, I mean, we've received it pretty much for all of the LGBTQ plus oriented programming that we've been doing. People do that. What initially started, raising concern was that we started popping up on the Proud Boys Telegram network, and some of us, myself included, were getting doxxed, and it went to another level at that point. And that's when we first started talking about, well, this might be different. And then, of course,
I'm just going to tell people what doxing is. I'm sorry, I've been doxed as well. Doxing is the intentional release of personal information, like where you live, at a minimum, with malicious intent. So, so your information was released in this terrorist organization's like feed as
communication network. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Well, and then a week out is when I got a call that someone from the congregation drove by the church, and they're like, I think something happened to our sign. And when I say sign, I'm talking about one of those heavy duty signs that sit out on the street or on the edge of the street, and you put messages on them and everything. And we had a really pretty intense windstorm the night before. And I'm thinking, well, a big limb came down, tree, whatever. So I drove to the church to check it out. And sure enough, the sign was destroyed. And I'm like, well, I don't see anything. So I pulled into the parking lot. And that's when I saw the burn marks up the side of our church. And as I got closer to the church, glass was under my foot. And it became quickly apparent that an individual who has now been arrested used, it looked like at least 2 Molotov cocktails to try to burn our church down. We were fortunate that where he threw it, it was less likely to catch because of the material on that side of the church. But also the weather was really bad that night, a lot of rain. And so things were damp. So we were incredibly fortunate that the elements, the divine, whatever you want to call it, seemed to be working in our favor that evening. But we realized, just the difference of a year from when we planned the first Pride in Geauga County to doing these drag events, how quickly the tone had changed. From just people, venting through email to now people taking physical direct action against our building. And so
organized, I just want to say organized action. So,
yes.
There's the United Church of Christ is planning more resourcing and conversations around white Christian nationalism and the rise of authoritarianism. Showing Up for Racial Justice is also doing this, but I think your story exemplifies this perfectly. It moves from kind of this like kind of splurting, feeling anger, targeting, to organized violence.
Yeah. And the individual in question who did this identified as a member of White Lives Matter, White Lives Matter Ohio in particular. So there was really even no attempt to hide that connection or that organization. This is an individual who several weeks earlier was part of, in Wadsworth, Ohio, a drag story hour event that got attacked by Nazis. And he was there and he was recruiting for White Lives Matter. So, and then of course, when we actually had the events, Patriot Front showed up. We were dealing with threats from Proud Boys. So this wasn't about angry locals, although there, I'm sure, were angry locals. This was about a concerted effort by organized hate groups that some of them aren't even from this area. Probably most of them aren't from this area. Seeking opportunities to shut people up. And so we realized at that point, not only that our security mentality around the events had to change, and we ended up having to invest a considerable amount of money into our security efforts for those events in particular, but that in light of entering this new era, and not only because of what we've experienced, but what churches and other organizations and libraries and schools have experienced around the country, that we are now in this new era where we have to also look at our 365 days a year, 24/7 security in a new light, and begin walking a really difficult path of trying to balance, and not just us, everyone walking this path of openness and inclusivity as a religious organization, with needing to keep people safe, and
Yeah.
how to navigate that, how to walk that line, how to keep that balance. I think not just myself, I think a lot of us are really struggling with how to solve that equation.
Yeah. Thank you. We're probably freaking people out at this point, but I so appreciate you sharing, because it's either going through something like this, which, God forbid any community of faith have to deal with this, but it's also witnessing this that is prompting people to have these conversations. And some have the opportunity to prepare in advance and create systems. So I want to hear from you, Richard, now. What started Parkway, even asking questions about this? Because as I mentioned, your pastor actually reached out to me about a year ago. So prior to Pride 2022, which was also where we saw a lot of organizing and other events, you all were already kind of talking about security and safety at your church in new ways. So just tell us what the process was like and what prompted it. And then don't get into the practicals yet. Then we'll have a little conversation, and then we will talk about the practicals.
Well, first, my blessings to you, Jess, and any spare strength I have, I give you. Keep it up. Please do. Our story is more one of precaution. St. Louis is in the news all too often for violence. We live in a compromised state, and there's still people that have their grandfather's Confederate flag. And for us, because we are out there, much in the way you are, Jess, in terms of what we host, we feel that it's inevitable and it's better to be prepared. Part of the preparation is, if you don't prepare, when something happens, somebody in the congregation during the service is going to call 911 on their phone, 911, and they might say the wrong thing. They might say something that will cause the police to give an urgent SWAT team response when one is not necessary. So what we really want to do is have we're calling them safety observers in place that have been trained to say, when can we intervene, or when is there actually a weapon displayed that we actually need a police response to. And we've established a very good rapport with our local police community. They come to our church and tour often and give us advice. We recently had an incident where there was, let me just say, a suspicious character, and a member of the congregation called 911, but the police department knows who we are. So they did a silent approach, no sirens. They came in gently. They found the person. They interviewed him. No violence occurred. So we want to do everything we can for intervention, but not be foolish about it couldn't happen to us.
Thank you, Richard. Let's get into a little bit of the practical. And as we talk about the practical, I might pause and ask, has your community considered this? And the purpose of that is not to do a catch-up. So if it's like, no, we haven't, go ahead and say, no, we haven't. It's so that we can learn from one another and find ways that we can be faithful as we move forward. If we're just in this environment of rising authoritarianism and public violence and more guns, we can be like, the story of is it a crab that gets boiled to death versus someone that just gets thrown into the water? We just become we're like, how do we adjust to this temperature and this temperature and this temperature without realizing what exactly, without bringing a full analysis to what's going on and losing connection to actually what we're called to be as a community of faith. I think that our local churches are ultimately communities of care, radical communities of care. And that we can be lights in this world and places that protect joy and faith and hopefully health and bodies as well. But when we look at historically rising authoritarianism, going back to the early church, living in that context, that was very difficult. And our churches in the early church looked a certain way. And then we look maybe to rising authoritarianism in Nazi Germany. And so many of our churches have had to reconcile with how come we didn't do anything? How come we didn't stand up? How come we didn't do enough? Versus like there was also an underground resistance movement, and it cost those folks and people a lot. And so reckoning with the stakes of what we're dealing with, because I think we do have to be honest with one another. We're not going to be able to have a faithful testimony and live in integrity with our faith and just be guaranteed that it won't cost us because of the context of the world. But that being said, how can we create a radical community of care? And how can we be plugged into our community and other folks so that we're not isolated and alone? So Richard, take us through some of the things, just the practical things that you've done with your church. And I want to start with how you have you done other, you mentioned like you have security, people that kind of watch and maybe have been trained to alert like, oh, this is, what is the difference between a benign like visitor who might, not of the, the dominant demographic versus a perceived threat? Like how do you kind of weigh that out? Have you been through, have you trained folks in that? What does that look like?
I have to point out that this is a goal. We haven't quite achieved it yet. And the background here is even 5 years ago, when we offered training in the congregation, we approached our usher group and said, would you be willing to take this training so that you could identify and make a person that we might need to approach and find out what's going on? They absolutely refused. So we find in the congregation that and really our own question to ourselves, should we really be putting our congregation in the middle of a threat like this? Or should we not? So we're coming up with that. We have proposed the safety observer. The point being, this is not a person who's going to intervene. This is a person who's going to observe from a safe distance, stay safe, and they are the link to getting help. But they still do need training in whether they're seeing somebody directly or on a camera screen. What is a concern?
Yeah, absolutely.
And so really, if a person's not actively displaying a weapon, you don't want to go crazy, because if you call 911 and say we have an armed intruder, you're going to get a very horrific response. And there's even a question in the chat about how did the congregation react to the story I told. The congregation wasn't even aware of it. The police came in so quietly, found the person, quietly escorted them out. And so you can handle a lot of these things during the Sunday experience without getting people, too upset. But our goal here is to really equip a safety observer and convince them that they are really doing a service to our community. They're not putting themselves in danger. And so some of the equipment that we propose to our council that we would set up would really support this observer role. And that's something I can share at the appropriate time.
Yeah, no, we can go ahead and go through that now. And I'm just going to open up, I'm just going to allow us to be in some tension. We have used abolitionist framework in the last 2 episodes. What I hear and why I think it's important for you, Richard, and for Parkway to be on this webinar is that you've been in the midst of a very thoughtful process, but are not in an abolitionist place yet, meaning you're working with the police and trying to figure out what safety in your community means. I do know, because I've had a conversation with you and your pastor, you are aware that police are not a neutral good, that impacts vulnerable people in your community. But I still want you to take us through the process that you've had and share your experiences, because I think that that's representative of many of our other UCC churches. So go ahead and take us through. Richard prepared some slides, including really practical things like what this costs that I think will be interesting. And then, Jess, we're going to turn it over to you to say, what did you do for security after this firebombing, and what conversations are, what questions rather are surfacing? And then we're going to open it up to Q&A for folks that are joining us.
Okay, thanks. I think if you could show that first slide, and the slides are just words. I intend to go through them fairly quickly. If anybody wants a copy of this actual report, we can get it for them and provide it to them. So we're learning how to be better about security. We've invited security professionals in to talk with us, and boy, they want us to do all kinds of things. And we decided, what is it that we're really trying to do? So here are the priorities that we came up with. The first is the Sunday experience, to protect people, and that's who's ever in the building doing whatever they're doing. The second one is we have a lot of gatherings. We use our facilities as much as possible for many different organizations. We host pride conferences and so on and so forth. So we really owe it to these people to have a safety procedure that they can follow, and so that they know what to do when they're in our building. And this is 7 days a week. Really, a third priority for us, and this is what the security people were going for first, is trying to harden your facility. When you have a church built 50 years ago, it was built to be open, and we still want it to be open. So we would have to spend so much money to lock it all down. Is that really worth it? Is that really what we want to do with our supplies? So that's third. And then fourth, also, this is what happens right away. You call the police. We had somebody steal some money out of the office, and the first thing the police said is, can we see the video? So are you going to put in equipment that supports the post-event investigation? How important is that? And so for us, our highest priority is really the Sunday experience. Next slide. So there are grants available out there, and this is what we were explaining to our council. When you get close to this, all the acronyms kind of stop making sense. So the Nonprofit Security Grant Program, but then we discovered that the window is already closed this year to try and get a grant for 2023. The window is going to open again in 2024. We actually have to work through a state agency to apply for this. And this is like writing a very, very detailed professional grant proposal. And it's not certain that you're going to get it, and that's going to take a long time. Next slide. So for us, we did want to make a distinction here, and I've heard this in these conferences too. People are using safety and security as if it's all one concept. But we've decided that it's really two very different concepts. So safety is about people, security is about the building, and our priority is safety. And then for the timeline, if we can't even apply for this grant until 2024, we might not get it. It's government grant. It might take a year. We're talking 2025. We can't wait. We can't wait for that. So next slide. So here, what we did is we took all the things that the security experts were telling us to do, and we sort of ranked them. Which of the goals do they support? How much money do they spend? And I'm sorry, the slide's a little bit long here. But you can see the most expensive stuff really is about security for the building and about supporting the investigation afterwards. So we've really decided that we want to focus on safety first, but in a way that can grow if we do get grant money. So next slide, please. So the recommendation, and this is literally a council report that we delivered just 2 weeks ago, is that we want to have this program where we have safety observers. And what we want the safety observer to do is to feel safe. And if they do have to call police, they have to do it quickly. Now, if you're in panic mode, Can you really take out your phone and unlock it and call 911? They're going to ask you 7 questions. Do you know the answers to the 7 questions? For example, unlike on TV, when you call on your cell phone, they don't know where you're calling from. You need to know the address of where you are. So we are looking for, or there are out, these already exist. We're going to do this. It's called a police alert. It's a button that you would wear and you press it like twice. And it's pre-programmed to tell the police, we have an actual shooting emergency. Please come. And so the observers will have this as a tool. If they do actually see a weapon displayed, we have to develop the training about how to observe that. They will be able to stay safe, get the alert that we need out there as quickly as possible. Our second recommendation is we need a PA system. We don't have a public address system, but we have people all over the building. If we had to tell you to shelter in place, how would we do that? If we gave the all clear, how would we do that? So a PA system is an important tool for us to put in. We've never thought about that before. Luckily, we can use our phone system, and we have a way that we can automatically turn all the speakers on all the phones and have a pre-recorded message. The security companies are big about video cameras, and video now has got such AI intelligence that can do facial recognition and license plate stuff. They get very excited about it. They really wanted us to install like 24 cameras covering everything. We can't do that. So right now we're looking at a minimal number of cameras that simply will cover access to the sanctuary. Again, it's a safety concern, but we want to do it in a way that it can grow. So if we do have a need for outdoor surveillance, we can add to it. And then the last thing down there is we already have a front door keypad system, but most people in St. Louis know the code to get in. So we want to put in a more sophisticated system where we can put in codes for specific groups, only active during certain hours. But you know, the folks that are, you know, the people that are going to commit active violence, they're being trained by watching the news at night. We had a St. Louis high school here that was had an interrupter, and several people died. And they actually showed the security video of the shooter shooting out the glass door. So no amount of locks, you know, are really going to provide safety for you. So at this point, the next slide, please. That's really the bottom line here, that we can get started in all these things for about $8,000. And if we were to do the full blown, what our security experts have recommended, it'd be about $36,000. So we want to get started now.
Thank you so much, Richard. There is a lot of such helpful practical things that you've offered that I'm sure are really valuable for folks.
Mm-hmm.
I want a couple of things that came up for me. One is that you have established kind of the line. When would you need armed intervention? And it seems to me you're talking about active shooter situations, that you're
Yes.
preparing in many ways that schools are, with the alert buttons and such, and that you're aware that calling the police doesn't mean they arrive. They don't manifest immediately to stop it.
No.
And
Right.
that is a really difficult reality. So if you do choose to call the police, it's really to either make an arrest or do the investigation in the aftermath.
Mm-hmm.
You know, cameras and surveillance came up on our first episode because obviously they can also be used if you're giving that record or that's being recorded with
Right.
a third-party security firm, that can be used against folks who might be involved in social justice issues that are seen as at odds with the police. And I will lift up here that I've been a part of a couple of different of those things having to do with care of immigrants, having to do with other things where actually police were not happy at all that our church was facilitating this. And that led to what I would call targeted tension, anything from unnecessary surveillance to bringing up like petty codes that were being violated. And so working with the police, there's always a power differential there. And that is a system that eventually is going to be at odds, I think, with what we're doing in the world. But I also acknowledge that in order to build the world that we want to live in requires imagination and alternative structures to be built.
Right.
And so people who are abolitionists and these things are actively being talked about and even manifest in small ways. So we talked about last week, some communities, and I wouldn't be surprised if St. Louis had a number where activists have just gotten together and said, if you're having a mental health crisis or encountering someone who's perceived as a disruptor, but who is not, a physical threat, is perhaps having a mental health crisis, or they're in the midst of an addiction crisis, you can call this number instead. And so, getting to know what all is involved in our communities, I think, is a really important part of this.
Yeah, it is. I think by what we read in the paper and see online, we're driven to the extreme thought right away.
Yeah.
And actually, most of life is not that extreme.
Sure.
There's so much that we can handle, without trying to respond to violence with violence. We are very interfaith active with our Jewish congregations and our Muslim organizations. And they have armed police presence. They have cameras everywhere. You have to be on the list to get in the door. We don't want to do any of that because that really shuts down our purpose as a church. So we want to stay as open as we can, but still know how to react if we have to.
Great. Thank you so much. One question for you before we turn it over to Jess from the Q&A. Where did you seek out the training for your observers?
We're still forming that.
Okay.
So I'm very interested in the book that's about to come out.
Yep.
As that. And we did very briefly, there was a conference sponsored by a regional church near us, and we attended that conference, and we were abhorred by what we saw. They are actually pushing safety teams that are armed, and are doing procedures that are really paramilitary procedures for safety inspections. And to us, we don't want any guns in the building, period. So we left that conference saying, well, we didn't learn anything. Yeah.
Well, good on you. The Community Safety for All Toolkit, which does come from an abolitionist perspective, does have assessment tools that you might find helpful, just like how do you mentioned you went to the ushers and asked them and they said no, and that makes sense. But if you have a conversation with your community and say, we actually need some folks who are willing to take on this role, would you be willing to do some training and conversing about who usually comes into our building, who are we most likely? It's a very approachable, very community oriented way to seek out these or to go deeper into these processes. And again, for those who may not know what I mean when I'm saying an abolitionist framework, that is, we imagine a world in which all people are free and thriving, with mutuality and autonomy. And we are we see systems that are at odds with that vision right now. And one of them is our mass incarceration system, which is enmeshed in systems of policing, enmeshed in racism, and actually a remnant of chattel slavery. And at the United Church of Christ in particular, we are so proud of our abolitionist lineage, being a part of the abolitionist movement prior to the Civil War, during and after, all of the work that we did with Amistad and supporting people of the African diaspora and asserting their own freedom. And so we just recognize that those horrible, dehumanizing, violent systems actually have morphed and exist in certain places. And so when we come into a conversation like this, we're mindful that in our attempts to secure our own property and to make our communities safe, we don't inadvertently build and strengthen systems that are harming our siblings. And it's complex. So with that, I'm going to just leave it. How are you doing that, Pastor Jess? How are you all managing that?
Well, I mean, to address a few things, I mean, I personally am an abolitionist as well. That's not necessarily a philosophy or perspective that is shared by everyone in my congregation, but we have definitely dealt with unpleasant issues with our local police as well as politicians in the area in the lead up. Well, like 2 days before our drag events, um, the police were trying to get us to cancel and would not tell us why. They'd say there were serious threats. Okay, what are those threats? We need to know if there are threats. They wouldn't share. And then when we tried to have a final conversation with them, they ignored us. And then the next day released a press release saying that we should cancel. They completely undermined the work that we were doing. They put all the issue on our shoulders, that if something bad happens, it's our fault. They didn't address the hate groups. They didn't say to the Proud Boys or Patriot Front or White Lives Matter, stay home, stay out of our county. You're not wanted here. Rather, they put it on us. Now, that said, on the day of, they did their job. But then just recently here in the last couple of weeks, we found out that trustees wanted to charge us, to bill us for the work of the police, making sure that nothing bad happened on those days. And we were very fortunate to have a lawyer individual locally here who was fairly well known, but he went and had a talk with them, and that issue was dropped. But we do not right now at this moment have the best relationship with local authorities, mainly because we were just simply saying, hey, how about you tell people who are threatening us to stay away and allow us to do what we have the right to do? That wasn't the situation. So the philosophy of abolitionism is very much on my mind in the sense of finding alternative ways to deal with if someone comes in who maybe is disturbing our worship service or a meeting or something like that. Other ways that we can do that without just calling the police. Now the problem is we're not only in a very rural area that's somewhat distant from folks who might be able to be a part of something like that, but we're also in an incredibly conservative area. So our ability to have alternative responses is somewhat limiting, not impossible, but somewhat limiting. In response to everything, though, we had donations come in from churches, from individuals, from all sorts of people that has enabled us to now purchase a fairly robust security system, cameras, exterior, interior, just like Rich talked about, the panic buttons, those kinds of things that we are investing in. My overall concern, though, is this. I've been trying to train myself to stop using the term safe space. There is no such thing as a safe space anymore. Schools aren't safe spaces. Churches aren't safe spaces. What's important for me is to be safe people. And that means being a congregation, being a community that even whether we have the best security system, whether we have no security system, that when people arrive at our church, if they're visitors, if they're whatever, that they encounter a open and welcome community. And the reason I'm saying that is because there was a comment in the chat about another church's flag was stolen, and someone in the congregation was worried about, well, if we put the flag back up, is it going to happen again? Are we going to make people angry? I've had people in my congregation say, why are we antagonizing them by flying a pride flag? And it's like, well, A, we're not antagonizing them. They may be antagonized, but we are not antagonizing them. We're simply flying a flag that we believe in, right? We're not doing it to make anyone angry. But we could easily become a safe space by stop flying the pride flag, stop promoting pride, stop promoting other queer events, but at what cost to the people in our community who need us there, right? We can shut up and we can become a safe space. because they're not going to bother us if we shut up. But for me, that's not an option. The flags need to keep flying because that's a signal to people in the community who need us. The events need to continue because that gives people in the community who don't feel seen an opportunity to be seen. So it's going back to this tension between a secure space, but also a space that's open. We could batten down the hatches and we could probably be pretty darn secure if we wanted to, but what's the cost of that? And I don't want to discover that cost. I believe that it is our call, it is our mission to be an open space, an affirming space, an inclusive space, a space of justice, a space of compassion. And if we clam up, if we close ranks, that's lost. And to me, that's just not an acceptable option.
Thank you so much. We're getting a lot of affirmations of the wisdom that you're sharing. We have a couple of questions before our time ends. Both Richard and Jess, do your churches have gun policies? And if so, what are they?
Ours is no guns allowed.
Same.
And then we have a question, and any of us can answer. If your congregation is starting at 0, what would you do first? And maybe all three of us can respond to this, and then I'll say a prayer for our time together. I would start with some community assessments, finding out who your community is, both within the church and around you. I will share again just the assessment tools with the Community Safety for All. That's really a wonderful starting place, even if it doesn't commit you to anything, but it is a relational, community-oriented process that everyone would benefit from, quite honestly, even if they're not facing these bodily threats and issues.
For me,
yeah.
Well, I was going to say not be in a red county. And I mean, I say that half facetiously, because that's where important work is taking place for sure. But it's, I'm not going to lie, it's been a lot. It's, like I mentioned earlier, my previous parish was in a very conservative region as well, and we dealt with very similar things. And while, the activist side of me is like, hell yeah, let's get into this, let's go. There's the side though that I'm a pastor and I need to provide pastoral care. And when these things happen, there's a lot of fear, there's a lot of anxiety, there's a lot of concern amongst the congregants that they could themselves be targeted. And so it's a very difficult thing balancing those two, the charge forth side of the activism, but also we need to slow it down a little bit. We need to have conversations. We need to be, focused on our congregants to make sure that they're doing okay as well. So I half facetiously say that I wouldn't be in a red county, but at the same time, that's where the work of education, that's where the work of trying to transform hearts and minds, it probably needs to be taking place more than any other place. I would just say my choice of ground zero, building up a church, would be, like you said, finding out what the needs are in the community, finding out what the concerns are, what the needs are, and then going from there.
Richard, anything to add?
Well, just my own perspective. What's wonderfully unique about UCC is the people in the congregation determine what the congregation does. And if I were starting, from scratch, I would start with conversations in the congregation. Do they have the same concerns? What do they want to present? How do they want to participate in the community? And what do they think is important? And as I did 5 years ago, you might be pretty surprised at what you find out.
Thank you so much. Thank you for everyone who joined us today. Some wonderful things were shared about your all's experience in the chat that I regret people watching this in the aftermath won't be able to see, but just know that this was a vibrant conversation and that you can join us live Thursdays at 3:30. Or you can find this recording. You can share a recording of this through our YouTube page, the United Church of Christ YouTube page, and the previous 2 webinars. We now have this 3-part series. We'll be heading into an artist series next week. We're starting Pride Month, and we're going to start with Amanda Udis Kessler, who will share hymns for celebrating Pride in our local churches. And then the following week, June 8th, we're going to be joined by the Q Worship Collective, and they'll be sharing live music and wonderful resources as well for Pride Month. So please continue to tune in and join us as we build community with one another, and we figure out these things together. That's a huge part of what a community of faith can do and what we do as the United Church of Christ. Jess and Richard, I'm so grateful that you've come on and to be a part of this important conversation, share wisdom, and maybe more importantly, the questions that you still have that we will continue to pursue together. For all of you, I pray that you would be held in community, that you would find the people that are able to have this conversation with you in your local context, and that you would know the sure, the beautiful, the strong presence of God as you go. In the name of the love of God embodied in all of their forms, and in the strong and beautiful name of Jesus, we ask, pray, and bless these things. Amen.
Siblings in Christ, if you were moved by this conversation, if what's been offered here has helped enhance your ministry or has nurtured your soul for the journey, please consider donating to the annual fund of the United Church of Christ by texting UCC to 41444. Your support will help to provide programs like this, which are an essential part of our ministries in the United Church of Christ. Thank you for your support. Be blessed on your journey and know that you are not alone. We are holding you in prayer. Amen.